Welcome to Public Forum, a community outreach program produced by North Idaho College located on Lake Coeur d'Alene. Featuring guests from around the globe addressing a wide variety of subjects, Public Forum serves to educate and enlighten. Please join host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart, in welcoming today's guests.
I am pleased to welcome you to the 8th week of a 10-week series titled Americans' 225-Year Journey in Search of Personal Freedoms. At North Idaho College, for the past 7 years, we've been using the Chautauqua format in which scholars and activists have taken a person in history, studied them in great depth, and then portrayed them. And so today we welcome to our program two people from the past, from history. First of all, Susan B. Anthony, who lived from 1820 to 1906. Miss Anthony was an American pioneer of women's rights. She was a teacher. She was co-founder in 1866 of the American Equal Rights Association, and she served as president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association from 1892 to 1900. Miss Anthony, thank you for coming from the past to our time and appearing on our program as we talk about the journey in search of personal freedoms.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
And I'm also very pleased to have with us the 28th President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, who lived from 1856 until 1924. In addition to being President of the United States, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in the year 1920. Before that, was governor of New Jersey from 1910 to 1912. He had served as president of Princeton University from 1902 to 1910. He held a PhD from Johns Hopkins University. President Wilson, welcome to the program.
Mr. Stewart, it's so nice of you to have me here. Thank you.
Thank you. And at this time, I'm very pleased to welcome, as always, Janelle Burke, who is our regular panelist, and Janelle will commence the questioning with our two famous people from history.
I'm going to start with Miss Anthony and ask you, what was life like at the time you were living for women, and why was it so important for them to gain the vote?
In my day, women could not own property. Women had no right to the legal custody of their children, no voice in the court, and no right to their wages that they incurred from their labor. The vote was important because laws made by men can be taken away by men, even if those laws are made on the behalf of women.
So you then began to get other women to feel the same way that you did, and you were an organizer.
I was an organizer.
And
Very
you had the
driven.
courage to go out and demonstrate on behalf of women's rights.
Oh, yes. Courage came naturally. Drive came naturally. Anger came naturally. The vote did not in my day.
Well, I want to ask President Wilson now what he thinks about this. How would you respond? You had a rather different view.
Well, actually, when I came upon the scene as the President of the United States, Susan B. Anthony was no longer a player, of course, but her progeny had taken over. But we viewed, during my first administration, the concept that women should be at home and that they should not be involved in politics and in man's business. I changed that perspective at the end of my administration and tried, of course, to get the Congress to agree. We failed, but in the second administration, and I will confide in you to say that it is a maturity that occurred, and for some political reasons as well, we ended up proposing the 19th Amendment, which, frankly, was the basis under which women got the vote. You cannot abridge the right to vote because of gender.
And what kind of an event caused you to change your mind? Was there a particular event?
Well, the political answer to that question is that I'm matured and I changed my perspective. But in point of fact, I was approached by Carrie Chapman Cott, who is Miss Anthony's protege. She convinced me, and she worked on this subject and changed my perspective. You see, when the women were chaining themselves to the White House fence, I did not think that that was funny. And frankly, I saw to it that they were arrested and they were not treated well in jail. But she opened my eyes, and we needed to get some votes the second time round, so that was all part of the process. But I think, in large measure, maturity helped.
But you're glad you did it.
Oh, indeed I am. The votes got me elected.
President Wilson, you indicated that you changed your mind, and yet women didn't get the right to vote in 1920, and you were reelected in 1916. So I assume from that a lot of women, and that the movement became very strong, were influencing their husbands or their fathers and others. So part of the success of this great movement, that women over time not only convinced you, but they convinced other men that it was something that must be done.
Mr. Stewart, that is exactly correct. The women did not have the vote when I ran for my second term. But the feeling among the men of this country, with the war then pending, and we had stayed out during my first administration, but we're in the war in the second administration, their perspective on what women were doing to protect and preserve this country changed. And it was those men who I believe elected me because I had changed my political perspective.
In addition to that, if you move on after your time, and of course you died before World War II, but in World War II, even to a greater magnitude, when more and more men were called into service and to go overseas, women did a tremendous job working in industry and all to keep all the machinery of the economy running, to help. Women had as much to do with the resources that we needed against the Nazis, and so therefore both World War I and World War II had something to do, did it not, with this progress?
Clearly, and we look back today with the benefit of hindsight and talk about Rosie the Riveter and her sisters, if you will. They carried the ball. But remember, when we offered them jobs during the Second War, we offered them jobs with the knowledge that when our boys came back, they would go home. They didn't do that very well, did they? They wanted to stay, and so they have.
Miss Susan B. Anthony, you did not live to see the vote. You died, I believe, in 1906, and the vote didn't come to 1920, but you and Elizabeth Cady Stanton and others that you've certainly worked with blaze the trail. And so oftentimes people who do so many wonderful things for the rights of others don't get the benefit of those results. But you, now that you've come to visit us, do you not have satisfaction in the fact that you've made life so much better for other women?
Oh, yes. Yes. To see the freedom and the amount of choice that women have today brings me much joy. Sadness, too, that it didn't happen at an earlier time in history, but satisfaction that it did.
There's a great story about you, and I believe the year was 1872, if I'm correct. And you did something that received a lot of attention, and you went to jail because of it. But you had a concept and idea that as you read the Constitution, you did not believe the Constitution said women could not vote. Mm-hmm. And so tell us that entire story. And it reminds me in some ways in the struggle for equality based on race, what Rosa Parks did. Rosa Parks took one act that really helped change the civil rights movement and really brought Dr. King to the forefront when they met his church that evening after she was arrested, and the boycott started. So there's parallels between different people in history that have struggled for freedom. So share the story, please.
I decided that it was time I challenged the constitutionality of the ban for women voting, and so I registered and I voted. My argument was that the dictionary says a citizen is a person a person in the United States who votes and holds office.
And women or citizens.
The argument seems to be that if women are people, if a woman is a person, she is therefore a citizen. And so I voted, and I was arrested, and I spent my day in court, and I was found guilty unjustly, and fined.
You also, if I can back up just a little bit, bail was set at $500, and I believe you refused to meet that.
Oh,
you wanted to stay in jail for the statement.
Yes, and then bail was set higher at $1,000, and again I refused to pay. My intention was that bail would not be paid, and I would take my claim to the Supreme Court. But my lawyer, against my wishes, paid the bail, nullifying my ability to go to the Supreme Court.
And then the trial took place after you were out of jail, and as you said, you were fined $100. And Enos, you come to be with us at this time in the year 2002.
Yeah.
I don't believe that you ever paid the fine.
No, this is a fine that will never be paid.
Janelle Burt.
Well, I must start with you again, Miss Anthony, and have you talk a little bit about what the Temperance Society meant and what was going on. What was going on in this movement in the United States at that time?
The temperance movement dealt with alcohol, and the problem being the effect that alcohol had on primarily men. Women had so few rights. Then to have men who are under the influence of this arsenic, I feel it's arsenic, it's poison, it had a negative effect on every aspect of a woman and a child's life. The temperance movement was attempting to control that alcohol abuse. And it was primarily my focus prior to suffrage.
So you were very involved in that and then moved over into the suffrage movement.
Yes, because each movement, each issue that I dealt with, whether it temperance or abolition or labor rights, came down to the legal voice of the woman, which was not heard.
Well, Mr. President, we have to ask you about some questions as to, you were a very well-educated man.
Indeed.
You certainly were very progressive in many ways, but it seems like your position with regard to women wasn't always as progressive. Is that true?
You must view it in the light of the times. When you look at it in the 21st century, I was certainly repressive. But if you take it back to the times of the early 1900s, everyone agreed with me. There were very few people, except for Susan B. Anthony and some of her friends, who disagreed with that concept. Women were simply not men, and the Constitution referred to men. It was the accepted standard of the times. There were some other things that I did that were wrong retrospectively, but certainly they seemed right at the time.
Now, what about your relationship with your wife? Wasn't her name Edith?
Yes.
And she was also an accomplished person.
Indeed. Of course, I lost my first wife, and that was a terrible blow to me. It took me a long time to get over that. I was a sensitive man, but as you know, I had a severe stroke late in life. I had several small strokes that were not discussed during my early years. And when I became, in some regard, physically incapacitated in the last year of my second term, I frankly relied upon my wife. And if you will, she ran this country. She was, in effect, the President of the United States. Though my mind was clear, my body was not. I could not use the left side of my body. I couldn't speak well. She kept the bandits from the door, and there were many of them that tried to take over, including my own vice president.
Mr. President, in relation to what we're emphasizing here on the program, with Susan B. Anthony as a guest and the issue of suffrage and women's rights. Did you agree, of course, when you were president, Miss Anthony had passed away.
Indeed.
But you were aware of her and others that there was somewhat of a coalition of movement, both for the temperance movement that wound up with an amendment to the Constitution during your administration.
The 18th Amendment, yes.
That brought prohibition to the country and then the women's right to vote. Were you also in agreement with the temperance movement?
Yes, I was. I believe that the country needed that. The 18th Amendment was passed during my administration. Again, you must view it in the terms of the existing time feature. We look at it today, it was a bad idea. It did not work well.
Didn't last long.
It didn't last long, and it didn't work well. It created its own problems. But in those days, it was necessary. And as Ms. Anthony told you, alcohol was killing our country. So we did what we could to resolve that issue, and that was the 18th Amendment.
Ms. Anthony, it's somewhat unfair almost to ask questions of you and the President about things happened after your death. You know, one is an individual in their time period in history. But as you've come to visit us today, and you look in the 21st century at the fact that life, fortunately, has changed dramatically for women. Not only the right to vote, but other civil rights legislation has been passed dealing with wage issues, and all there are still challenges and still problems. But the role of women in the political process, and you'd be delighted to know that there's a significant number of women in the United States Congress today, and some of them are governors and a lot of members of the state legislatures. And now that power and influence is there, and we have repealed prohibition, if you could take those developments and put them back in your time, would the temperance movement portion not have been necessary? That is, when women have legal rights and processes, can you control the abuse of men? And as you've indicated in the presentation earlier, that a lot of men did abuse their wives because of alcohol. How would you react, if you can, to this change, that the two don't have to go together? In other words, can people in a democratic society have the right to have a glass of wine, for example, and not be forbidden, if you move away from the and are able to solve the abusive portion of what was happening?
I am a Quaker. I do not drink alcohol. But I see in your question that in this day and age, the abuse would not be as significant because woman could stand on her own.
Or could sue, or there are laws both protect children and women.
Yes, with a legal voice, she could care for herself and her children. Therefore, the abuse might tend to be more on the individual who abused the alcohol, more so than the woman and the child who could protect themselves.
Thank you. Janelle Berg.
Miss Anthony, would it surprise you to know that in our day we have a coin called the Susan B. Anthony dollar? And would you comment on that?
I've been told, and I find it ironic, for my wage as a teacher in the 1840s was $1, and now a coin commemorates my wage.
I think that's pretty remarkable.
Oh, yes.
Mr. President, turning to you, at the time you were president, all members of the cabinet were men.
That is correct.
All members of the United States Senate were men.
That is true.
All members of the House of Representatives were men. So basically, you were traveling among an all-male society at all points, for the most part. And you were trying to convince men, for the most part, of whatever your particular position might be. How do you think that would have been different had there been women who would have been among those that you were trying to convince, and those you were trying to govern with?
You know, you asked me almost an imponderable. When you go back to those days, it was in the beginning of my administration just something that was never conceived of, except for some women who were out on the front of the street in front of the White House. I think that had there been women in the Congress, And you recognize there weren't even women lawyers in most states who were not admitted to the practice. I, of course, was not a lawyer, but that is typical of the way things were viewed. It would have been easier to show that women can function in the political arena and women can function as men, as well as, or perhaps better. It would have been easier.
I think your point is well taken, that it was simply not conceived of at that particular point.
Beyond the pale of conception.
But it took time to bridge that gap, to get people to think in a different manner.
As late as 1917, when I started to come around to the concept of women's vote, and I tried to bring it before the Senate, it failed. It again was brought up, and as late as 1920, it ultimately passed and then was circulated among the states, and finally Tennessee, being the golden 36th state, passed it. But it took some time. Any process of constitutional amendment is like eating an elephant, just a little bit at a time.
I want to follow up on that. In your presentation on your visit here from the past today to a significant sized audience, you indicated that Tennessee was the final state to ratify the amendment for the right to vote, but this is true of many amendments, and they go to the states, and all the amendments with the exception of one have gone to the state legislature for ratification. What's interesting, the repeal of prohibition went to state conventions, and the people were voting on delegates in each state, so there was a referendum of the people. But in the case of Tennessee, I believe it was by one vote.
That is correct.
Tell that story, because it's very interesting how one vote can change the course of history.
You know, the politics of things are such that many things are resolved in the cloakroom, in the thick cigar smoke, and it was pretty well understood that Tennessee would fail to ratify the amendment. But the story is told that one member of the state legislature, just before the vote was cast, received a letter from his mother, who reminded him of the role of his mother and the role of women, and he was so moved that at the 11th hour he changed his vote, and it was passed in the state of Tennessee, and then it became a constitutional amendment.
It's one example of many throughout our history where individuals will say, if I can make that contemporary today, and arguments that were probably also true from your time, and that is that my vote doesn't count. But there's elections by the voters themselves where one candidate wins by one vote, or in a legislative process where there's one vote. In fact, President Andrew Johnson, which you would know from past history, survived, was free of conviction in the U.S. Senate by one vote after he'd been impeached by the House. So those votes are really important. Susan B. Anthony, would you take a moment to talk about some of the other pioneers you worked with, like Elizabeth Cady Stanton? There was a real important core of women who really brought this to the focal point that wound up with success later.
Elizabeth Cady Stanton is far more fluent in her speech. If she were sitting here, so easy would the words flow. For me, they've always been very difficult. She had an ease and a knowledge, but she also was married and had children, and therefore her voice was heard by many who refused to listen to me. There were others, Lucretia Mott, the Grimke sisters, Lucy Stone, each with an idea, some who followed the road with temperance, some with abolition, some with suffrage, and many who follow each road.
Another speaker on our series here has talked about in movements for freedom and rights for people that oftentimes there's separation between groups, one particular group's working for their rights but not joining forces with another one. That split your movement to some extent, did it not? Some women were saying until there is complete freedom for black men, or particularly the adoption of the 14th Amendment, that your movement would take second place, whereas others says we must integrate together. Is that not true, that it caused some split?
Yes. for a time, it was the Negro's hour. And during that time, we stepped aside. But when you step aside, you lose a following. Also, when you ask for too much, often you are denied. When you ask for little, possibly you receive that request. So narrowing your issues was a safer policy.
And did you follow that more cautious or conservative policy than some of the other women in the movement?
As I reached 80 years old, suffrage was all I thought about. My concerns with temperance and slavery and labor laws were not as prevalent any longer. I knew suffrage was the answer to all of the problems that we had dealt with since my childhood.
Mr. President, we're just about out of time, but how do you see that when different movements either join together or separate?
I suspect that the women's suffrage movement was the key to many. It has altered and changed the dynamics of politics in this country. And looking back on it, it was absolutely necessary and should have occurred much earlier. It may have changed history. I would think so anyhow.
On that note, on behalf of Janelle Berg, our panelists and our staff here on our program, we thank both of you, Susan B. Anthony and President Woodrow Wilson, for coming to our time and talk about something that was so important in our topic about Americans' 225-year journey in search of personal freedoms. And we thank you for your time. We thank you for your candid answers. We will continue with some other famous people next week. Ladies and gentlemen, I sure hope that you're enjoying this rather long special series that we're bringing you each year. We, in the summertime, try to have a rather specific topic that goes on for several weeks. And again, we have 2 more weeks of this particular topic. I hope you'll be with us again next week at the same time when we'll be looking at the issue of Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
Recorded on the campus of North Idaho College, Public Forum is the longest-running entirely college-produced program on PBS. Each episode is pre-recorded live and is an educational outreach from North Idaho College. Please join us again at this same time next week for another edition of Public Forum on this public television station.